Good morning, NASCAR fantasy racing fans. Welcome to Dan Beaver's NASCAR fantasy racing pit stop. Pit stop. I'm I'm Charlie Turner. Of course, he is Dan Beaver. Morning, Dan. How are you?
Good morning. I'm awake. It's the first
Yeah,
battle.
it's early. I know we've had to do some schedule shifting this week just because of other commitments. So thanks for your patience if you're watching today, or if you missed it when we announced it yesterday, and you're catching a replay today. Hopefully, you can get your advice from Dan on the Bristol night race today, and make some great picks for the race this weekend. So let's talk. I know you've said in the past that Bristol is your favorite track, and the night race is your favorite race. How does that affect you professionally when you're looking at this thing as a fantasy racing guru, I guess?
Well, it really doesn't. You still got to make the picks by the number, and this can be kind of a wild card track. But even so, it's kind of like it's not as bad as Talladega or Daytona, the restrictor plate super speedways for
Yeah,
wild card.
let's talk about that a little bit more before we get into the specific recommendations, because this is known. I mean, I think the general public, the general fantasy racing public, thinks of this race as a as a true wild card because they've been told that by bloggers and TV talking heads and stuff for so long. But it is actually, I think, looking at the numbers, Bristol's a relatively predictable track compared to one of the restrictor play races for sure.
Certainly compared to them. And you look back and you see that Darrell Waltrip has 12 victories here, and there are a number of drivers with 9 victories here.
Hmm.
This week we've got 3 drivers with 5 victories apiece, Jeff Gordon and the 2 Busch brothers. Obviously, they don't think it's a wild card race, or they didn't think it was a wild card track in those seasons that they were dominating. So it's a rhythm track, and on rhythm tracks you can rattle off some big streaks. However, in the past 2 3 years, with NASCAR's emphasis on parity, the perceptions kind of catching up, or reality is kind of catching up to perception. It's become a little bit more of a wild card track in the last couple of years, not because it's a short track and not because there's a lot of beating and banging going on here, but because the competition is so even. You take the car advances out of it, NASCAR not allowing the teams to make too many advances on their cars, and you've got a bunch of drivers who cut their teeth on short tracks coming up to the series, and they never really lost that skill. So we've only got, I think, 4, maybe 5, I think it's 4 drivers with back-to-back top tens, and only 2 of those drivers have more than 2 consecutive top tens entering this weekend. So streaks have gotten to be pretty difficult to get and maintain here. Then you look back at spring, we had some surprise people at the faces in the front of the pack. Ricky Stenhouse Jr.'s second place finish, Eric Almirola's third place finish. And there was a relatively long green flag segment at the end, so it's not like they just snuck up. They just did a strategy call to get up there. Those drivers were running pretty well in the last quarter of the race and deserved their finishes. So it's a little more difficult to call now than it was in seasons past, but it's still not as bad as their play tracks.
Okay, well, so knowing that going into this thing, let's talk in terms of like a salary cap game first, the first half of the show, and what are your recommendations there? Do you start with the low dollar guys, or do you start at the top?
I think this might be one of those races you start at the top. You look for those marquee drivers that you think are going to have the potential to win. Jeff Gordon, last week, he won his first race since 2001 or 2002. I keep getting these numbers flip-flopped in my
I
head.
think I think it was 2001.
Okay, so he won his first race at Michigan since 2001. His last win at Bristol, another track that he dominated in the past, was 2002. So you've got about that same kind of winless streak for more than a decade. The last time he won at Michigan, previous to last week, he won from the pole, wins the pole this week, goes out and wins the race. If he starts up front again at Bristol, I think you got to consider him a strong possibility to win again. He's going to be expensive. He's not going to sneak up on anybody, but you still, if you can get that winner, get that dominant winner, especially in some games, or he's leading the most laps, or he's getting those other points for the other factors that they're including, then you've done something. You've got a good points earner. Down below him, Dale Earnhardt Jr. is running well, but I'm not sure that he's a good salary cap play. He's going to be expensive. He's only got top tens in like 25% of the last 4 years, the last 8 races at this track. So not necessarily a good pick where the salary cap is concerned, but certainly a good choice to finish somewhere in the top 10. Jimmy Johnson starting to rebound. Hasn't always been his best track, so he's another guy who might not be a good salary cap pick at Bristol. Kevin Harvick hasn't done particularly well here in the past, but after last week's strong run at Michigan, this is the kind of track that should suit him. He likes to be aggressive. You can attack the corners at Bristol, so Harvick might be another good pick. He's certainly someone that I'd want to watch tomorrow, Friday, and see if he's going to practice and qualify well. And if he does, he could make it to the top of your roster.
Is there anybody that you see that would be you think would be kind of a sandbag pick? When I say that, I mean somebody that you don't feel will show up on a lot of rosters, but could be a good solid pick to do well.
I think we've got 2 solid sleepers to win. Brian Vickers would be one. He's one of those drivers with more than 2 consecutive top 10s. He enters with a 5-race streak of top 10s, 3 of which were top 5s. So we're not really talking about him for chase contention. We were talking about Marcus Ambrose a couple of weeks ago and how a win at Watkins Glen could just sneak him in. I think Vickers is in that same place right now. A win could sneak him in. So you got to pay attention to him, and he's not going to be overly expensive in salary cap games. When we get down to the Yahoo portion of this segment of this thing, we're going to talk about him again because I think he's a good overall driver. Casey Kane, I think, might be another driver who certainly is in the middle of the salary cap range. If he's still expensive in games because he's got Hendrick Motorsports power under his hood and because the person setting the salary caps hasn't lost sight of what his potential is. But he hasn't been living up to it in recent weeks. Bristol could change that. Last year he almost swept victory lane, finished first in the spring, second in the fall. He's got top 10s that bracket that, so he's the other driver with more than 2 consecutive top 10s at Bristol. And I don't think there's a reason to, at this point, until they hit the track, there's no reason to think he can't back that up with at least another top 10. And at his level, his price, he would make a good pick there. Then, of course, we've also got Jeff Burton back in Tony Stewart's car this week. So he's going to be cheap in salary cap games. He's going to be one of those drivers that is going to be on a lot of rosters. The good side of that is if something happens to him like it did last week with his mechanical failure, his electrical failure, it's not going to hurt nearly as much because a lot of drivers or a lot of players are going to have him. So I think Jeff Burton's almost a must-have just because of the circumstances.
Anybody else down there who's cheap that you think everybody should be playing?
You know, once you get down to the really cheap drivers, they're usually cheap for a reason, and there aren't a lot of part-time drivers here, so no, not really. We're going to look for someone that has a good average improvement, perhaps someone that races better than they run, races better than they finished, perhaps. Ricky Stenhouse called him out a little bit early with his second-place finish. It was a little bit of a surprise, and I don't expect him to back it up with another top 10 this week necessarily. But last year he was consistent. He had a 16th in the spring and an 18th in the fall. So those are numbers that indicate he probably could be somewhere in the top 15. And if he fits that last niche on your roster, that could make him a good value.
I'm going to ask you about a couple more drivers before we move on to the Yahoo game. These are just guys that I'm curious about because, well, let me start with the first one, Matt Kenseth. Is there any play here for Kenseth this week? It's getting to the point where he either has to score points or he's got to get a win or his chase thing is questionable.
I think his biggest task this week is going to be to stay out of trouble. He can't have back-to-back accidents. He can't have back-to-back bad races. If he does, that could put him down in that hornet's nest that's right above the 13th place in the points. Ryan Newman got dropped down there at Watkins Glen and Kenseth. We talk about him as being safe because he's high in the points, but it doesn't take long, and we've got 3 races where something could happen. If he gets crash damage here, if he got a blown engine at Atlanta, then all of a sudden he's not safe. He did win this race last year, and he's going to be front of mind for a lot of players. But if you look back, that victory is surrounded by a bunch of sub-10th place finishes. He was only 13th this spring. We expected more out of him. The 2 races prior to his victory were 25th and the 35th. Taking a longer view, he has 6 top 10 finishes, 6 consecutive top 10 finishes that came right before that little spate of 2 bad runs. So he's not an easy pick this year. He hasn't done what he did last year. If the numbers aren't really in his favor, you got to wonder exactly what is going to happen this week, what effort the team is going to bring with him. So not going to be surprised to see him run with the leaders, but I'm not going to predict he will either.
I think I'm going to know. I know the answer to this one, but I'm going to group these 2 guys together because their parents did. Kurt and Kyle Busch, any pick there? They are 2 of the 5-time winners here at this racetrack, after all.
They'll either finish in the top 5 or they'll crash. And that,
there you go. This is a wild card, isn't it?
It is for them. Actually, every track's a wild card for them. Both of them are incredibly talented drivers, but both of them have a strong tendency to race over their heads, and that's fatal in fantasy racing. They suck you in week after week after week, and when you don't take them and thought about them, you feel bad about it for 95% of the race, right up into the time that one of them hits the wall. So, yeah. I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think, of the 3 drivers with 5 victories, I think Gordon's got the better shot at adding a 6th. But they get in the right place at the right time, they could win. They could crash while leading. So
you just put out a big caution flag for anybody who's thinking about taking them. There are good reasons to take them, and you're not dumb if you don't. I guess, put it that way.
Actually, they should be sponsored by Xanax and give that to their fans. But.
There you go. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to the Yahoo game. And before I do that, let's mention that, of course, Dan, you can read Dan's Yahoo article at yahoosports.com every week. How many pages is it this week? I mean, it's like a book every week.
It's like 21 this week.
21 pages of NASCAR fantasy racing brilliance every week. Fresh stuff from the #1 fantasy writer and expert in NASCAR fantasy racing. So if you don't have that bookmarked and aren't reading at least some of that every week, you're not doing everything you can to do the best for your team. And Dan also writes for rotoworld.com, and completely unique content from what he writes at yahoosports.com. So get all that stuff before you make your picks if you want to make a real push for doing well. So there's my plug for Dan Beaver. Now let's talk about that Yahoo game. Where do you start this week? Are you going to go A, B, C?
Well, it doesn't matter with Yahoo. You got to treat each of those groups by themselves. Group A is where the majority of your winners are going to come from. There's a reason for that. They were the top 9 or 10 drivers from last year, and most of them carried that momentum forward. Group B is challenging this year, in large part because we got a couple of really good drivers down there, and you've got to start thinking about allocation management, but also because you've got drivers down there that can just call their shot and rattle off a good finish without much warning. Every now and then you're going to get a Paul Menard down there that does really well. And Group C's become challenging because there are 2 picks that everybody wants every week, but you can only start them 9 times each. So Kyle Larson and Austin Dillon are going to get exhausted before the end of the year. And
yeah, that's 9 times each. That's half the races. That means for the other half of the races, you got to pick somebody else down there.
somebody else, and they're probably going to, and on the weeks that you pick them, they're probably going to get beat by Larson and Dillon.
Yeah.
The obvious choices are avoid them on things like the plate track, so you've got 4 races right there. You can think to avoid them on the road courses, so you've got another 2 races there, and you just kind of have to think about that going forward. We're in this part of the season though where we've only got 1 more plate race coming up. You've got to start thinking how many more allocations do I have for those 2 drivers, and am I going to make it to the end of the year, or how I'm going to make it to the end of the year. This week, since we're talking about C, we might as well start down there. You've got Jeff Burton back in the roster again. Tony Stewart's going to sit out at least 1 more race. Don't know when he's going to come back. No reason to think he's not coming back at Atlanta, but he might not. But for now, is Jeff Burton's in the car at Bristol, and he's got as good a shot down in Group C as any of the other Group C drivers to run well here. This is a track where it takes rhythm, it takes some experience to get it right, usually. We've got rookies that manage to finish at the front, but for the most part, a veteran driver is a little bit of a more consistent play down there. Jeff Burton certainly knows how to get around here, and he's got the car to do it. Hopefully he got his bad luck out of the way last week with that electrical failure, and this week he can give Stewart-Haas a good finish and kind of elevate the mood in that team. I don't think the organization as a whole needs their mood elevated. Harvick ran well last week. Kurt Busch ran well last week, right until the time that he hit the wall. But that 14 team, they need something good to happen. I think Burton could give it to them. So he's the obvious pick this week, and he got announced early enough that anybody watching this today can still get him on the roster. Last week it was, just a couple of hours before the roster is locked, but this week the announcement came early enough that most of the players can get him. And if that happens, it's the same as we talked about in the salary cap game. If he crashes, if something happens to him, it's going to take everybody down with him. So it doesn't hurt you as much as it would to have a Kyle Larson who crashed last week, and he hurt a lot more because not only then did you waste an allocation, but we're in that part of the season where he's not on quite as many rosters. So if you took the gamble on him last week, it turned out to be a gamble. I thought he was going to run well. Then you ended up losing a lot of points, but you also lost a lot of ground to your competition.
Yeah, it looks to me like Burton's just like a no-brainer. You have to take him this week. If you're thinking about anybody else and getting cute, don't. This isn't the place to do it.
Well, and even then, there's another caveat. Whether or not you take him, whether or not you take a differentiator or roll the dice, depends on where you are in your league, too. We're not to that point where you have to start worrying. You have to start throwing Hail Marys. But if you need a good differentiator, he's not going to be it.
Right.
A lot of the active players in your league are going to have him. But a Justin Allgaier, who's been consistent on short tracks, could be your differentiator. Let's get the exact numbers in front of me. Help if I do this right. Okay. 3 short track races this year. His best was a 17th at Bristol. His worst was a 23rd at Martinsville. So he's in a very narrow band of finishes there. You can expect him to finish somewhere around the 20s again. He's going to get outperformed by Larson, Dillon, Burton, maybe, unless those drivers have problems. It's fairly unlikely that all 3 will have problems, but you have to try to anticipate what your competition is going to do. If you know they're going to take Burton, if you know they're going to take either Larson or Dillon, Allgaier makes a good differentiator and could help you make up ground on some of the competition if any 1 or 2 of those 3 drivers experience trouble this week.
Before we move into A and B, what would you say to somebody who listened to the guy from Stewart-Haas last week saying that all of their emphasis is going towards getting Danica Patrick into the chase?
I'm not sure that it matters. It's a good thing to say. She has a chance. She's going to have to win a race. She's so far down the points. I don't think she's capable of winning a race right at this stage or one of these next three races. I think she might be a good choice at Talladega. She likes restrictor plate racing, but that'll be too late. She had that top 10 finish at Kansas earlier this year, so Atlanta, another cookie cutter track, another 1.5 mile dogleg oval, could be a good chance for her to sneak in there, but it's going to take some strategy. And those are things that you just can't anticipate. You cannot handicap for strategy unless it's Paul Wolf and Brad Keselowski. You can kind of throw that in there because they're so good at getting the strategy calls right, or Chad Knaus and Jimmy Johnson. But for the most part, you just cannot anticipate what the end of these races are going to look like. And Bristol, not a bad track for her overall. I think she's a decent short track racer. She's okay in traffic. She tends to get into trouble, not always her own making. And then Richmond's going to be, I don't know, Richmond's going to be wild. You're going to have a lot of drivers going for broke in that one final race. And the best thing for everybody, for all the drivers who are locked into the chase to do, would be just to lay back, try to stay out of the carnage, and get as much momentum as they can.
Yeah, get out of the way.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving up to B. You want to talk about A first and then B?
Yeah, we started at the bottom. We might as well go up. But
Okay.
I think you got a couple of really good picks in B that are not drivers that you've managed to pick most of the year. Vickers, we already talked about with his 5-race top 10 streak. He used to be really good on the high banked concrete ovals in the Nationwide Series, but that did not carry over into Cup for the longest time. He finally seemed to get it. And this is one of those tracks where a switch seems to flip at a certain point, and you end up doing really well for a while. So the switch flipped for him 5 races ago, and until he stops scoring top 10s, I think he's a good driver to put on your roster. Of course, I think we kind of said the same thing back at Dover and earlier in the year, and he goes out and has a problem early in the race then. So
yeah, I was gonna ask you how much you look at Dover results when you're looking at Bristol.
I used to. It used to be my comparative for Bristol. So I'd put those two tracks together and see who could get streaks on those two tracks. But since I started monkeying around with the upper groove of Bristol just consistently over the last, I don't know, 5 years, I'm not sure when they started grinding down that top groove. They've made it so much different now that it's pretty much a unique track. So I think you just look at Bristol alone. If you know what's going on at Dover, you can use that as a tiebreaker. In some cases, if you've got a driver that trying to make the choice between two drivers and he's got a good record at Dover and Bristol, then that might push off the fence. But I don't think you don't make it the primary thing that you're looking at this week.
Okay.
In Group B, then, my other choice would be Marcus Ambrose. He's got top 5s. He's always been good here. He managed to get top 10s in his first 2 starts. He has top 10s in his latest 2 starts. Another 5th place finish back in 2012, which gives him 3 top 10s in the last 4 races there. And this is going to be one of those opportunity races for him. He also seems to run a little bit better under the lights than he does during the daytime. So he comes in with a 1, 2, 3 race top 10 streak under the lights, and 4 of 5 races under the lights have finished somewhere in the top 10, with a 3rd place finish back in his rookie year, 5th place finish in 2012, and another 5th place finish then this spring. So Ambrose those are the 2 drivers I'm starting, Vickers and Ambrose. Then you get back down into that usual cast of characters. You can't ignore Keselowski and Logano, even though they both can be a little hit or miss here. When Keselowski's on, he's great. He's got the back-to-back wins, but then he's also got some truly bad runs here. So Keselowski, if you got enough allocations, Logano should be on your provisional roster just because he might get you those disqualification points. But you might not want to start him. You probably want to start a driver that you've got a lot of allocations remaining for. So we jump up to Group A. I think you got some nice picks there that you haven't looked at. Casey Kane and Matt Kenseth are probably the two drivers that'll make my provisional roster this week. Kane, because of that streak of top tens, because of the emphasis that Hendrick Motorsports should be putting on getting him into the top 10. He may not get that top 5 finish that you really want from a Group A driver, but those are becoming a little bit more rare for drivers other than Jeff Gordon, Jimmy Johnson, or not even Jimmy Johnson right now, Jeff Gordon, Kevin Harvick are getting the top 5s, and you're going to exhaust them the same way you have to worry about exhausting Dillon and Larson down at the bottom. Johnson's going to come on strong during the chase, so no real reason to start him this week. And Kevin Harvick, even though I think he can break out of his funk, he's another driver where we talk about the switch flipping and drivers finding the groove. The thing happened in reverse to Harvick here a little bit ago. He had one of the best records on this track as a rookie up until probably back in about 2009, the switch seemed to flip the other direction. Mm-hmm. And since then, he's got only one top 10 in how many races? One top 10 in 11 races. So by the numbers, you're not going to have him on your roster. You're only going to have him on your roster if you believe in current momentum, what he's done this year, but not based on his Bristol record.
All right. Well, I think that pretty well winds it up for the night race at Bristol, which is Saturday night. The qualifying is it today or tomorrow?
Tomorrow. Everything's tomorrow. 2-day show. Which brings us to another one of my my soapboxes. NASCAR really needs more 2-day shows and get a midweek show, short track. They can get in quick.
Yeah, I would love to see it. I think they've experimented with it a little bit in the truck series, and it seems to work. I don't know why they don't try it with the big show.
Well, they didn't get the race going last night the truck race going last night because of rain. They'll do it this morning, but I think the Bristol truck race is another one of those. They can get people in the stands. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, this is just such a great week at Bristol. If you had a whole week to spend at a racetrack, this would be the week, and that would be the place to do it, I think. So, okay, he's Dan Beaver. Follow him on Twitter at Fantasy Race. Read his Yahoo Fantasy Racing profile every week at yahoosports.com and his other fantasy article at rotoworld.com. And then watch for we have a new issue of On Pit Road magazine coming out with more unique fantasy content along with the other general NASCAR racing information that we put in that magazine. Every issue, we'll be coming out with that. Follow me. I'm Charlie Turner on Twitter at OnPitRow. We'll be back next week when we'll talk about going to Atlanta, one of my favorite racetracks, and we only get to go there once now, and so I'm looking forward to what you have to say there. Any last thoughts, Dan, or we're going to check out of here?
Just enjoy the race.
Yeah.
This is one where your roster almost becomes secondary. Just enjoy the race.
Yep, set it, forget it, watch that show. It's going to be a great one. All right, we'll talk again soon. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on Dan Beaver's Fantasy Racing Pit Stop.